French politics are broken right now, and I'm not talking about the massive protests you've been seeing in the streets for the past few years, although they're definitely part of the story. And the thing is, I think it's likely to get worse, and to understand why, we need to go back a bit. In the 1950s, France rebooted its constitution and launched version 5.0 of the French Republic. And for the next 60 years, 6 of the 7 elected presidents were from only 2 parties. There were 2 from the center-left Socialist Party and 4 from the Conservative Party, who went through more names than they had presidents. So to keep it simple, I'll refer to them as what they're now known as, the Republicans, but just not those Republicans, or as the Gaullists, after the founder of the party, Charles de Gaulle, who was the French general who led France's resistance against the Nazis during World War II and later became president. I said 6 of the 7 elected presidents. In the 1970s, there was a one-term president from neither of those 2 parties, but we'll talk more about him later. The last time a president was broadly popular was in the 1990s and 2000s with Jacques Chirac from the Gaullist Party, then known as the Rally for the Republic, or RPR, or the Union for a Popular Movement, or UMP. Like that's why I'm not gonna go into all the names, because there's a lot of them. He's mostly known for not really accomplishing anything during his 12 years as president. The one thing he's really remembered for is for opposing the 2003 US invasion of Iraq.
Coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war.
To which the US responded by briefly renaming French fries freedom fries, but that's a story for another day. After him came Nicolas Sarkozy, who was elected mostly by surfing on the wave of Chirac's popularity. He was seen as his designated successor, serving as Chirac's Minister of Interior and Finance Minister, and he was also the leader of the Gaullist Party at the time. The thing is, Chirac was mostly popular for keeping his head down and being as uncontroversial as possible, while Sarkozy had a very different style. He was way more bombastic, and honestly, he was quite a bit further to the right of Chirac. During his term, he implemented mandatory minimum sentencings, gave the police more power, toughened immigration rules, and made it harder to get citizenship. But before doing any of that, he gave himself a 170% pay raise, followed by cutting taxes for the rich and loosening labor laws. Sarkozy only served 1 term as president, and probably the main reason he wasn't re-elected was because of the 2008 financial crisis. Even though he was a conservative, in response to the crisis, he started calling himself a socialist and announced the end of laissez-faire capitalism, as well as calling out the dictatorship of the market. But at the same time, he was seen as flirting with the far right. This is a guy who famously said he would use power washers to clean up France's low-income, largely immigrant neighborhoods. Just to be clear, he didn't mean municipal cleaning crews coming in to wash the streets. He was joking about, metaphorically, cleaning the filth of crime from the areas. Carshare, the German brand that he referenced in his joke, actually had to issue a statement saying, "Hey, we clean dirt, not humans. Please leave our name out of your politics." By the end of his term, with the effects of the financial crisis lingering, anger against the rich was sky high. This was the height of the Occupy Wall Street movement, which was also a thing in Europe. You know that cliche of X party can run a ham sandwich and still win the election? Well, the Socialist Party decided to test that hypothesis. And that's how this charismatic black hole known as François Hollande became president in 2012, becoming the only second socialist president in France's Fifth Republic. At this point, the Socialist Party weren't exactly advocating for a proletarian takeover of the means of production. They were more like bumbling social democrats. So think Bernie Sanders with more accordion music, a French mustache, and a whole lot of incompetence. Hollande was so bland and uninteresting that he was nicknamed after this, flamby, kind of custard type of dessert that is generally accepted as the lowest common denominator of French desserts. And the nickname was so enduring that, that it actually takes up about 1/4 of the English language Wikipedia entry for flamby. A couple years into his term, during a visit to Germany, his plane was struck by lightning, and his nickname was updated to creme brulee. Oh god, that's too hot. Okay, so let's be honest. Hollande's presidency was pretty much an uninterrupted string of blunders that was marked by incompetence and scandal. But he did legalize gay marriage, so that's in the win column. This is so much better, by the way. But undeniably, one of his most important decisions was to appoint Emmanuel Macron as Minister of the Economy halfway through his term. He was a former banker who was seen as a pragmatist moderate who could tackle difficult reforms and do what needed to be done regardless of ideology. So that was quite the shift from his hard left, diehard socialist predecessor. Macron's main accomplishment as Minister of the Economy was the law for growth, activity, and equal economic opportunities, also known as the Macron Law. His predecessor's version of the law was focused on increasing the French people's purchasing power, which say that 5 times quickly. But Macron, when he took over, broadened the law in scope to make it include a ton of things, from cutting red tape when you're getting your driver's license to cutting the payouts and damages that companies have to pay to employees in cases of wrongful termination, among plenty of other things. This was a huge package of reforms, and it was described as a catch-all law by his critics because it included plenty of things outside of his portfolio as Minister of the Economy, like transportation, for example. He made buses, he did the driver's license thing, and in hindsight, it bore a lot of Macron's hallmarks, implementing business-friendly policies like cutting back on worker protections and social gains to make the country more competitive. It was also passed using Article 49.3 of the Constitution, which you may have heard of. It came back in the news more recently, so we're going to talk more about that later. The left saw the Macron law as Hollande betraying them by forcing neoliberal reforms through Parliament. The backlash was so severe that by the time the law came into effect, Macron said that he no longer considered himself a socialist. He stayed on as minister, but rumors began to spread that he was preparing to leave, which he eventually did a year later. Of course, this was perfect timing to run for the presidency. And although he was essentially a political novice, he had never held public office until he became Minister of the Economy only 2 years earlier, the Macron law made him the highest profile minister in Hollande's cabinet. And his firing/resignation put some distance between him and Hollande, who was so unpopular that he didn't even try to run for re-election at that point. So with the Republican Party in a crisis of leadership following Sarkozy's defeat to Hollande in 2012, and with the socialists reeling from the epic debacle that was their second socialist administration in over 50 years, Macron was basically able to cleave off the moderate wings of both of those political parties. He cultivated his image on one hand as a ruthless pragmatist with a background in business, but without the right social conservatism, and on the other hand, as having sympathies for the left where he started his political career, but without their pie-in-the-sky naivete. Let's do a super quick detour. Remember that one-term president from a third party in the 70s that I mentioned at the start of this video? His party, the UDF, or Union for French Democracy, was trying to be more of a center-right counterweight to the more conservative Gaullists. So the UDF has a one-term president succeeded by the only other socialist president apart from Hollande in the entire Fifth Republic. And then the party basically faded into obscurity. By the 2000s, they renamed themselves the Democratic Movement, or MODEM, and the last time they tried to even field a presidential candidate in 2012, they got single-digit numbers. And I should say, the MODEM isn't unique in terms of being a third party running for president. There's at least a dozen political parties in every presidential election from across the political spectrum. There's the communist on the far left, there's another far left party we'll talk more about later, there's another couple of parties until we get to the socialists, then you have the MODEM in the center, the Gaullists to the right, and then you have half a dozen political parties on the right, all the way to the far right. They have the Green Party, there's a guy whose main platform was space exploration and going to the moon, and there's even this one guy. In 2017 still, this guy was talking about the skull shapes of the Caucasoid and Negroid races. Like crazy stuff, like absolutely insane stuff. And he was interviewed by journalists and running for president in 2017. Things get pretty wild here, but we're disregarding all of those because all of them get under 5%, most of them get under 1% of the vote, and honestly, no one takes them seriously. And that's my point about the MODEM, is no one took them seriously, and yet they were the most successful centrist party of the last multiple decades until Macron. But now the French people are done with the status quo. They've tried the right again and again, and they're done with it. They've tried the left, and it was an unmitigated disaster. And now there's this new kid on the block who's kind of both, but more importantly, he's neither. And it worked. Nearly half of the people who voted for Hollande in 2012 voted for Macron in 2017, while another fourth of Hollande's voters went in the other direction towards the far left. The Socialist Party went from 29% of the vote in the first round of the election in 2012 to only 6% in 2017. The Conservatives did better. 17% of Sarkozy's 2012 voters went to Macron, and another 14% went to the far right, but they were able to keep 60% of their voter base. However, that wasn't enough to make it to the runoff election, meaning for the first time in their existence, neither the Gaullist Party nor the Socialist Party were going to be in the runoff election in 2017. It was Macron against the far right. Okay, the National Rally, probably better known under their previous name, the National Front. They definitely deserve a video of their own, or several. But to make it quick, they were founded in the 1970s by this guy, Jean-Marie Le Pen, and a group of quite unsavory characters, including a literal former member of the Waffen-SS. Le Pen, over the years, expressed doubt over the existence of the gas chambers, calling it at best a detail of World War II history, defended Philippe Pétain, who led France's collaboration with the Nazis, and said that Mr. Ebola could resolve the issue of immigration in a few months. Yeah. So now his daughter, Marine Le Pen, who is honestly not that much better, is at the helm of the party. And over the decades, dozens of National Rally politicians and members have been found guilty of hate crimes, including murder, desecrating Jewish cemeteries, and plenty more. There's a really long list of them. I mean, they're so beyond the pale that when they made it to the runoff election for the first time ever in 2002, every other party across the political spectrum, far left, centrists, moderate right, decided to band together to vote for whoever wasn't the far right candidate. And they got absolutely crushed, with Chirac getting 82% of the vote to the National Front's 18%. Now it's 15 years later, and for only the second time in history, they've made it in the runoff election against Emmanuel Macron. And basically the same thing happens. Every party, left, right, center, whatever, band together against the far right. They call it the Republican Front as the response to the National Front. But this time, Marine Le Pen got 34%, nearly double what her father got in 2002. She was still beaten by Macron with 66% of the vote, and that's a landslide by anyone's standards, but there's definitely something happening here. By the way, I should mention that we're not really looking at parliamentary elections in this video. It's obviously a lot easier to have a small party be viable with just a couple of elected officials than be a real presidential contender. But if we wanted to break down the voting coalitions over the years, we'd be here for hours. However, I did want to mention that apart from a fluke election in 1988, the National Front never had more than one elected representative until 2012, when they got 2, then 8 in 2017, and now they have 89. Which, if you ask me, I think they overshot their goal by 1, if you catch my drift. So Macron becomes president, and his supporters rejoice. But many are pretty quickly disappointed. They voted for him to kind of break the wheel of French politics. They were tired of politics as usual. And what they got was peak neolib. Macron cuts more red tape for businesses to turn France into what he calls a startup nation. He cuts taxes for the rich, while at the same time imposing a new tax on fuel. Now, to be honest, this tax on fuel, which became a huge deal, was a really, really small tax. It would have been a few cents per liter of gas. It would have been literally pennies every time you fill up your tank. Hi there, editing Stan here. So this probably would have been true for most people, but it's worth noting that the taxes were scheduled to increase until 2022. They would have remained relatively modest, but for households using a fuel-based heating system and needing their car a lot, this could have amounted to up to 500 euros per year, which on a modest income is not negligible. It was the principle that people didn't like because it would mostly affect the poor, independent truckers, farmers, people who live in rural areas and who need to drive their car every day. This sparks one of the biggest and definitely the most sustained protest movement in French history. From November 2018 until the start of the pandemic in 2020, every Saturday, hundreds of thousands took to the streets in cities across the country wearing high-visibility yellow vests to demand real change for the status quo. But not everyone hated Macron. Sarkozy's voters, who mostly stayed faithful to the Gaullist Party in 2017, flocked over to Macron at the next election in 2022. So in just 2 election cycles, the 2 parties that had completely dominated French politics for the last 60 years had completely collapsed. The Gaullist party, now called the Republicans, got just under 5% of the vote this time, while the Socialists dwindled down to less than 2% of the vote. Meanwhile, Macron went from 24% in 2017 to 27% in 2022 thanks to the influx of Republican voters. So here's what happened. When Republicans lost all their moderates to Macron, they had to find those voters elsewhere, so they went way further to the right trying to court National Rally voters. But no one wants fascism light, so Marine Le Pen's share of the vote actually increased since the last election. And not only that, there was an entire new far-right party that sprung out of nowhere. This TV personality called Éric Zemmour thought that Marine Le Pen wasn't quite far-right enough, so he decided to make his entirely new party, and he got more than the Republican Party. He got 7%. He actually got more than the Republicans and the Socialists combined. The two parties that completely dominated French politics are getting less than this TV personality's like brand new party that he just sprung out of nowhere at the very, very far right extreme of the political landscape. And if you add up Zemmour and Marine Le Pen's votes in the first round of 2022, they actually got more than Macron's party. Meanwhile, the left, after the collapse of the Socialist Party, completely splintered into half a dozen political parties on the left. The lion's share of the vote went to this guy, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who arrived in third place between Marine Le Pen and Éric Zemmour. So, the thing about Jean-Luc Mélenchon is he's most often compared to Bernie Sanders by political commentators outside of France, and they do have some things in common when it comes to their commitment to helping the working class and to responding to climate change. But Mélenchon defended Vladimir Putin for years, as well as Syria's Bashar al-Assad. He's highly skeptical of the EU. He wants to remove a NATO missile defense system from Eastern Europe and leave NATO entirely, calling for closer relations with Russia and recognizing Crimea as a Russian territory. Now, to be fair, he has changed his tune on Russia since they invaded Ukraine last year. He now refers to Vladimir Putin as an adversary, but he still argues against more help for Ukraine. So since the 2022 presidential election, after they splintered into so many parties, and that was pretty much a disaster for the entire leftist movement, they coalesced into this movement called the New Ecological and Social People's Unions, or NUPES, which is led by Mélenchon and essentially encompasses everyone to the left of Macron. So round 2 of the presidential election happens, and repeat of 2017, it's Macron against Le Pen, but this time Macron gets 58%, Le Pen increases her share up to 42%. Anyway, he wins. He's in his second term now. His first term was marked by one of the biggest protest movements in the history of the country. So what does he do now? He decides to increase the age of retirement.
As you might have expected, this resulted in massive protests.
At 62 years old, France had one of the lowest ages of retirement in the world, and people wanted to keep it that way. But the government argued with rising life expectancies, falling birth rates, and skyrocketing debt, the reform just had to happen. Several estimates said the system could go bankrupt in as soon as a decade. And, according to the government, by raising the age of retirement by just 2 years, it would be safe for the foreseeable future. But the protesters weren't having any of that. Initially, when they announced the reform, 59% of the French population were against it. After hearing the government's explanations, though, that number rose to 72%. It probably didn't help that Macron's budget for 2023 said that the pension reform would save enough money to cut corporate taxes, which, combined with Macron's image as an elitist determined to slash social programs to lower taxes, convinced most people that the reforms were either entirely unnecessary or could somehow be avoided if the government weren't so trigger-happy with tax cuts. To make things worse, he forced a law through Parliament using Article 49.3 of the Constitution, the one that I mentioned earlier, which is basically when the government doesn't have the votes in Parliament to pass a law, they can do a poker move and say, I'm all in, guys. You either get a majority of Parliament to vote to censure the government, which blocks the law and forces the Prime Minister to resign, or by default, this bill becomes a law. So it's not a trump card because the government does have some skin in the game, but it's often described as one because honestly, no one ever calls their bluff. And Elisabeth Borne, Macron's current prime minister, is on track to becoming the PM with the most uses of Article 49.3 in French history, having used it 11 times. And she's already talking about when she might use it next. And just as the pension reform riots were starting to lose steam, another wave of riots erupted in Paris earlier this month over the police killing of a teenager during a traffic stop. The point is, who knows how long these protests will last or how violent they're going to get. This is not good for Macron or his party. His approval rating is under 30%, so is Born's. And he's in his second term, he can't run for re-election no matter what. Yeah, about that. I had to put this video on hold for 2 weeks, and since I shot this, some of Macron's allies have started to float the idea of changing the constitution to allow for more than 2 terms. He has no obvious political successor, and if things continue the way they're going right now, anyone who backed this law in the first place is going to have a really hard time running for the presidency. And the mainstream parties that dominated French politics before Macron are essentially gone. The next 2 biggest political forces are the tankies on the far left and the fascists on the far right. And the National Rally has consistently been gaining support over the last 30 years, with most people saying that it's only a matter of time before they actually win a presidential election like far-right parties have in other European countries in recent years. So what do you think is going to happen after Macron? Will a centrist successor emerge by the end of his term, or will the party fade into obscurity like the UDF did in the 1970s? And if that happens, will things just go back to the way they were before with the socialists and the Republicans, or is that gone forever and now the big political powerhouses are the far left and the far right? It's really hard to tell, but it's worth paying attention to. This channel has been a long time coming. I've been working as a journalist for the past 10 years in France, China, Spain, Germany, and a bunch of other countries. And I was super grateful for all the opportunities that I got, but I've been wanting to do things my own way for a long time, and this is me finally jumping into the deep end and giving it a chance. And there are so many things to cover in Europe at the moment, from climate change, the energy crisis, the rise of the far right. There's a ton of protest movements. You might have heard there's a war happening. At the same time, another topic that I really want to talk to is the media. We're in the middle of an information revolution that happens less than once a generation. And it's gonna be really fascinating to talk about how things are evolving right now. But something that's really important to me is doing my own reporting, going on the ground, talking to people, gathering my own footage, doing interviews, touching grass occasionally from time to time. Because a lot of the political commentary on YouTube is using reporting from other media sources. And if everyone is just talking about everyone else's reporting, where's that information coming from? And if that's something that you want to support, if you want to help contribute to original independent reporting, it would be incredibly helpful if you could join my Patreon and help fund this one-man operation that I have going here. So you can find the link to that in the information down below, but if you can't afford to, that's fine. Subscribe to this channel, like the video, click the bell, all the things that every other YouTuber tells you to do, and leave a comment. Honestly, tell me what you thought of this video. If there's another topic related to this one that you would like me to cover, I would really like to hear from you. If I got something wrong, tell me how I'm a dumbass and tell me what I missed. I'm calling this channel Barely Informed because I don't honestly know that much more than anyone else, but I want to figure it out. So if you can help on Patreon, or if you just subscribe to this channel, share this video, leave a comment, and all of those things, I'm unbelievably grateful. And yeah, I guess we'll see what happens.